are. So thanks for having me along this morning. And as we heard there, my presentation today is on the mental health impact of sexual violence. And I'm in doing this, I guess I learned a lot myself because I was trying to pull together all of the different research studies and things for Northern Ireland on this topic, and I found there was actually very little. So I think as mental health champion, this is something that I need to look at as well, you know, so hopefully we can continue the discussions after this event today. Um, so let's first of all start by looking at the definition of sexual violence. You may have already covered it in with previous speakers, but I think it's important for me to note that it's any sexual act or attempt to attain a sexual act that's unwanted. So unwanted advances, attempted rape, all of those things come under the broad definition of sexual violence. And it also includes any actions directed against a person's sexuality. And the whole point is here that coercion is used. So coercion can be physical force, psychological intimidation, including blackmail or other threats that people use in an attempt to engage in a sexual activity or sexual act. Sexual violence, of course, is by any person, regardless of their relationship to the victim, and occurs in any setting. And I think it's really important to point that out because that's actually a relatively new addition to the definition of sexual violence. And of course, years ago, we felt that sexual violence really wasn't something that could happen, or these activities weren't really possible within the boundaries of a marriage relationship, for example. So things have moved on, and we realize, of course, now that sexual violence covers all of those areas too. Importantly, it includes sexual acts when the person is unable to give consent. And of course, that raises all sorts of issues around consent. And we're only really starting to grapple with the issue of consent. And it's something that we need to learn about, and from a very, very early stage. This is something that needs to be taught in schools. Consent for touching, consent for hugging, consent for, so really important. But ultimately, it also includes sexual activity when a person's drunk, and so drunk that they really are not able to give consent. When they're drugged is another category. When the person's asleep, or even when the person's mentally incapable. And again, that's a really, really difficult one too, because how do we determine whether someone who has a severe mental illness or cognitive impairment that's impacting on maybe their inhibitions in some way, is consent possible under those circumstances? So these are all important definitional issues that we as a society need to grapple with. So sadly, sexual violence is incredibly common. I was reading some World Health Organization reports, and they were stating that in some countries, nearly 1 in 4 women particularly may experience sexual violence by an intimate partner. The extent of sexual violence against men is less well known because of the stigma, and men are much less likely to report sexual violence, but it happens to men and women and boys and girls. It's important to point that out, of course. Up to 1/3 of adolescent girls, and this is across the world, report their first sexual experience as being forced, and that is a really, really shocking statistic. And of course, sexual violence does result in deaths and mortality, and these can be through suicide, disease, the transmission of HIV and other viruses through unwanted sexual activity, and then also murder. And in some countries, sadly, we still have murders of honour, previously described as honour killings, that happen after a woman has been violated or a girl has been violated in some way. The people who are affected by sexual violence in many, many cultures are stigmatized and ostracized by their families and others. And this happens in Western societies as well. So sexual violence is a huge issue, and it impacts on people's physical health and also, of course, their mental health. So in terms of understanding sexual violence, and this is a rather crowded slide, I apologize for that, but it's important to understand the context within which sexual violence occurs. So thinking about the purpose, there's still a lot of negative stereotypical views around sexual violence where it's referred to as a sexual act and to do with that sort of sexual attraction and sexual feelings. This is actually not, it's more about the expression of power and dominance over the person who's been assaulted. And even in marriage situations, whenever, previously it was thought that it was acceptable for men within marriage to force themselves on their women, but that on their wives, so that again is not legitimate. It's no longer legal, and sexual violence occurs within marriage, and that's very, very common within marriage. The rape of women and men is used as a weapon of war. Again, this idea that it's an expression of dominance and superiority. It's about establishing hierarchies, and this happens within prison settings as well. So the idea of the conquest and degradation of women or captured male fighters, it's an expression of power. It's also used to punish women in various different societies for transgressing moral or social codes. So if in very traditional societies, women who commit adultery, as it would previously have been described, or who are drunk in public, would have been subjected to sexual violence as a way of chastising and punishing them and maintaining control. So it's around gender relations, it's around power relations, and it happens in all sorts of contexts, but it is usually about power rather than sexual attraction in any form. And once we start understanding that this is about power and it's about exerting power, and violence is used in that way, then I think we get a more sort of detailed understanding, or a more nuanced understanding of what the mental health impact of this can be. So it occurs in many, many forms. There's rape within marriage and also rape within dating relationships. And again, some of the worldwide evidence from the World Mental Health Surveys has shown that that is remarkably common. Rape by strangers is much less common, but that's our stereotypical view of sexual violence. Rape also happens during armed conflict, and indeed we're only now recognising that this happened within our own society as part of the Troubles. And years ago we felt that that wasn't the case, but now we're really coming to terms with the fact that that was, and there's an impact, and a transgenerational impact of that. There's also the sexual abuse of mental or physically disabled children, which sadly is still quite common. The sexual abuse of children, forced marriage or cohabitation, and even things like the denial of contraception, forced abortion, all of those things come under that heading of sexual violence. Sexual violence also includes any sexual act that's directed at the person's sexual organs or sexuality, so female genital mutilation, virginity inspections, forced prostitution, and trafficking. And unfortunately, that is actually very common, where we have migrants who are brought into the country believing they're getting different types of jobs, when actually they're forced into debt and ended up working in the sex industry as well. So those are all forms of sexual violence, and these are things that we need to talk about. The magnitude of the problem is absolutely huge. This is the iceberg kind of analogy from the World Health Organization's report on this matter. And we can see there at the top, we have fatal sexual assaults, which are much less common. We have a tier there where rapes are reported to the police. Rapes are reported in surveys, but there's a whole subsection there, that bottom part of the triangle. Rape is not disclosed because of shame and blame, sexual exploitation, economic vulnerability, women working in the sex industry, and men indeed as well, and that's the kind of the bulk of the sexual violence that happens across society. And then we have their unwanted sex acts, blackmail, forced sex in marriage and dating. It's all part of that, but we only ever hear about the very, very top layer there. So what is the mental health impact of this, and why is this different, I think, from other types of traumas? And we need to understand sexual violence as a trauma, but it's a different type of trauma because our sexuality is so bound into who we are. as humans, and it's linked to our ideas about ourselves and our value, and that have historical basis. So the first one there is this idea of the loss of bodily autonomy, feeling that your body is not your own, that you've not given permission. That is the ultimate violation, really, that loss of bodily autonomy, and that can lead to feelings of shame and blame and guilt, and all the negative discussions around rape and what people were wearing and all of those sort of things really feed that shame and the blame. So this is a trauma where the person blames themselves and feels guilty about what has happened to them, and that marks it out as very different from the other types of traumas where we have something awful happen, and it's much more likely to lead to post-traumatic stress disorder, because it leads to that person ruminating about that trauma and what their part was in that trauma, and that means that the person finds it very difficult to move on. We'll talk a wee bit about the PTSD in a minute. There's also the depression, the hopelessness, the despair, and the low self-worth that comes with this, particularly repeated acts of sexual violence. The person feels that they're not valued. We also have anxiety about the attack happening again, that hypervigilance that comes with trauma. And again, if it's a one-off attack, it's less likely. But unfortunately, for the majority of sexual violence happens within relationship contexts. So the fear of a repeat attack is actually very, very, very real. And then we have trauma-related symptoms, which include panic attacks, uncontrollable flashbacks, where the person has that fight or flight response, that stress response, and then also agoraphobia, where they are afraid to go out, where that limits their day-to-day lives in such a way that many of them can't leave the house or can't go about their everyday activities. So this is a little slide that I used to explain the effects of trauma and stress on the brain. And this is what we're talking about here when we're talking about trauma and sexual assault. So we have in the middle, safe and social there. That's where we are most of the time when we are subjected to an assault or a trauma. We either go up into fight or flight, where our stress response is activated and we panic, and we're primed to run away or shout or get aggressive. Or we have the other response, which is shut down. That's the freeze response. It's actually very common that women and men go into shutdown whenever there's sexual violence, because the trauma is so great, and sometimes going along with it, that kind of response, well, it will be over more quickly, or simply the body actually freezes. That's a stress response, and the person is completely immobilized and cannot and is not able to fight back. That is a normal response to a trauma like this. So when the body goes into fight or flight or even freeze, that has a really, really long-lasting impact on the person, and it requires a degree of regulation and a degree of healing to get back up there. If we're talking about a repeated assault, then the person's systems can be recalibrated so that they're frozen and stuck and shut down all the time. It's like the body adjusting to this new world. Or they can be stuck in fight or flight all the time. So fight or flight is anxiety, that kind of anxious response all the time, and freeze is that shutdown, that trauma response, where they're numb, disconnected, and often suicidal and hopeless. Sexual violence is associated with a much higher risk of post-traumatic stress disorder. And post-traumatic stress disorder is characterized by 3 sets of symptoms. We have flashbacks and nightmares, and that is where the event comes back into the person's memory, into the person's consciousness when they least expect it. So they could be sleeping and they will have a nightmare. Or they could be going about their business during the day and they will smell something that will remind them of that attack. It's a subconscious trigger. It's the body's way of protecting the person so that they can fight or run away, because this is about to happen again to them. But it's as if they were right back there. So you will do anything to avoid being in that flashback, that nightmare. It changes the body's stress response. It recalibrates those thresholds. So the person becomes hypervigilant. That's a third symptom there. They are hypervigilant, they're on edge all the time. But then they're also stuck in that sort of shutdown as well, that avoidance and numbing. And PTSD is like having all two of those going on at once. So there's no safe and social there. There's a shutdown of emotions, that disconnection, that unable to feel any emotion, that dampening down of emotion, and also that hypervigilance, that sort of being constantly on edge. And it's a really horrendous place to be. And PTSD requires a type of treatment that recodes that memory so the person can make meaning from it. Often it's about realizing it was not their fault and there was nothing they could do about it. And getting rid of those flashbacks and nightmares so that the person can be in that safe and social place. But it requires trauma-focused therapy. So the other mental health and related conditions that we will get from sexual violence includes post-traumatic stress disorder, very, very common. Personality disorders. Personality disorders, we're really starting to understand that that's just a way of labeling a trauma response that has impacted that person's whole being. Dissociative disorders, where the person almost comes out of their own body or they're dissociated. Again, this is a way of coping with the trauma that has happened. They distance themselves, psychologically distance themselves from it, but it can lead to dissociative disorders where there's almost like that distancing, that the person doesn't remember things, that they're not fully present. And it's an adaptation to abuse over time. There's attachment difficulties, of course, and particularly child abuse can lead to insecure attachment patterns where children develop into adults who don't trust people, who avoid intimacy, or can be too eager because they use their sexuality to please other people. And either way, it doesn't bode well for future relationships. Addiction is also something that can happen, and that's quite common in relation to sexual violence, because it's a way of coping with those stress response feelings, that the trauma, that shutdown, and that hypervigilance. Addiction, alcohol and drugs can be used, and they give people some relief from that, but of course they then become dependent. Chronic pain, not chronic pain, it's a wee typo there. Chronic pain can also come from this, as well, as people hold tension in various different parts of their body, or they have very real pain responses that are related to the abuse and violence that they've suffered. And of course, sexual dysfunction is very, very common, because sexual violence disrupts those pathways, those sexual response pathways in the body and the brain too. Thankfully, all of this stuff is treatable if we can get in there early, but people rarely ask for support because of the stigma, unfortunately. So what do we know about this in Northern Ireland? Well, we have very little information that I could find, certainly, and I consulted some of my colleagues as well who studied this area. What we've come up with is the NUS-USI Student Consent Survey. It was conducted a couple of years ago, and this is actually really, really worrying. That showed that 28% had experienced unwanted sexual behaviour, 5% had reported it, 76%, and this is where it gets worrying. 76% believed it wasn't serious enough to report. 5% had experienced attempted rape, and 5% had been raped. And again, those numbers, and in the survey, it was over 100 of the students had said this. And the risk of PTSD following rape, and indeed attempted rape and other types of violations where there's a physical assault, is really, really, really high. And PTSD doesn't go away, it lasts for a long time. So this is very, very scary. 3 in 10 had sought treatment. So even things like emergency contraception, sexually transmitted diseases, they're not asking for help with those issues. Very, very concerning for your future physical health too. And of course, then the likelihood of having to have an abortion and all of that entails, or bringing a pregnancy to term. Massive mental health implications there. 15% who told somebody had formally reported it. So that's the group of people who actually had picked up the courage, still not reporting it to the authorities. And half didn't want to think about it. And that suppression can lead to your flashbacks and nightmares, because the brain and the body does remember, even if we try very hard not to think about these things, and they can come up in our subconscious. And it's probably not a helpful way of managing this sort of issue. Shame and embarrassment are very, very common, still very common. And surprisingly, 10%, 1 in 10 of the students actually had another student confide in them about being raped, which would actually suggest that these figures are an underreporting too. So I'm going to leave it there and take some Q&As, and I'm sorry I went over time a wee bit, but hopefully that's been a useful tour of the kind of outcomes that we might anticipate following sexual violence. So happy to take questions, discussions, anything, and thanks for your patience.
Siobhan, thank you. That was really informative and interesting. I will remind people that they can put questions in the Q&A section of the site. If you scroll down to the bottom, you should be able to put in a question. Just before I hand over to Louise, who's going to handle the questions for us, Siobhan, the figures always shock me around people reaching out, either are not reaching out for support and not reporting. And I'm wondering, do you have any recommendations as to what we all need to be doing, whether that's support organisations, governments and society, to try and encourage people to come forward to actually, even not necessarily formally report to the police, but seek that help that is so necessary in terms of that recovery journey?
Yeah, I think we need to, we really need to keep having these conversations about what consent is, what consent looks like, and we need to raise awareness across society. I mean, that whole generation of students, I had hoped that things would be different for this generation of students, and I just can't see it changing. And I think the recent discussions that we've had around consent have been very, very negative in the media. So we need to keep doing that with campaigns, with public information campaigns. The student campaigns are particularly useful. There was one in the South that was one of the taglines was "Boozing's not choosing." I thought that was brilliant. We just need a lot more of those things, and we needed more information about what works to change attitudes and to change views. And in particular in Northern Ireland, we need to look at those groups where, groups of people who are least likely to report this and find out why. So a lot more research, I think, as well. But we need to use psychology and public information campaigns and just to get these messages out there. And some really interesting stuff that you can do with even the soap operas and using role models. So let's just broaden it and do more of that. And of course, organisations like the wellbeing services in universities can be maybe more vocal about how they're there to support people who've had unwanted sexual experiences and have been subjected to sexual violence. So all of that will help. But people don't ask for help, and maybe even training each other. So 10% of students are confided have someone confide in them that they've been raped. So why don't we could try and train those students to help the person get help. And it's not about reporting it. I think we need to just know that this is, get the message out there. This is not your fault, and actually why not get some support to help manage this. And then we might get to the stage where we're reporting this. Well, there's a work there needs to be done with boys and men too. This is not a woman's issue.
Exactly.
Perpetrators and abusers as well. We need to try and think about men and as victims too, is what I was trying to say. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. No, that's really helpful, and I think certainly in Sexual Abuse and Violence Week, this helps us having the opportunity to talk about what it is, about continually trying to break that silence, so that people do reach out for the support that's available there. And obviously there's a whole stream of funding that we need to ensure that there is appropriate support there as well. But just get people to come forward is going to be a big step. So I will hand over to Louise, who is going to take us through some of the questions from the attendees today. Thank you, Siobhan.
So we have a lot of questions from our attendees today. First, I'll start off with a comment from Helen Crickard at Reclaim the Agenda, who points out that at the moment the Department of Health does not have services in place for abortion support. I know, Siobhan, that you've mentioned that. We also have a question around given that there's often confusion about sexual consent, and there's some situations where people have experienced a sexually violent incident, but the perpetrator didn't fall into a traditional bracket. Maybe it's a misunderstanding, etc. Do you have any suggestions for how we might talk about that without appearing to blame the survivor or excuse the behaviour of the perpetrator?
It's
easy one to start with.
Yeah, that's the crux of it. We need more discussion about consent, what consent is and what consent looks like. I think we need to take it away. If you want to have a discussion about that kind of incident, we need to use, we need to have resources there where we have scenarios where we can discuss this without making it personal to individuals. So I think that's where your soap operas are really, really useful, where you can talk about different characters and what happened there. I think there was 13 Reasons Why had a rape scene in it, and it was just incredibly powerful. There was a lot of talk about the suicide scene in that, but you know, that to me is the sort of thing that we need to have, and we need to talk about that and what happened there. And this was a violation that happened at a party, and I just thought it was such a good example of how rape can happen. And so we need to use fictional characters, is really what I'm saying. And we need to start at a really young age. I mean, I'm telling my toddler, you know, she goes around hugging and kissing everybody. And it's about actually saying, right, you know, if do you want to be hugged? Do you want to high five instead? You know, what way do you want to say hello, fist bump? So it starts very, very early. We need to nearly wire it into them from an early age about consent. And then use those scenarios, those fictional scenarios, to start to have open conversations about what happened.
It would help if I unmuted myself. And we have another question from Julie Clark, who asks, do you foresee that services for trauma-focused therapy in Northern Ireland will improve and be more accessible and timely?
Okay, this is a really important one. So our mental health strategy is out for consultation now, and the whole strategy is supposed to be trauma informed. So what does trauma informed look like? Trauma informed means that you have an environment where people feel that they can ask for support, regardless of what has happened to them, you know, and that at every stage they will receive compassionate care. So that's a starting point. There's also a whole section that's about the right support at the right time, and trauma focused care would be in there as well. So we are developing better mental health services, and please respond to the strategy and talk about this group of people and where they might seek support, and whether they need particular types of mental health services that are different from others, or whether they can fit into the trauma services that are there. So we also have the regional trauma network, and we're hoping to progress that soon as well. And a bit of discussion now about whether that should be open to people who aren't victims of the Troubles. But I think a broader recognition of sexual violence as a trauma, and we need trauma focused therapies for that. Of course, there need to be training as well. We've got a cohort of people from both universities, I think, that are trained in trauma focused therapies now. So it's about just putting all that together and making sure that we do better there.
I've got a question from Cheryl, who asks, what role do you think schools play in starting the consent conversation?
Yeah, schools have a really important role to play. This is part of it's part of what schools should be doing at all ages, in an age appropriate way, obviously. So it starts off in your playgroups, where we talk about little toddlers giving consent for hugs and all of that, and touches and things like that, you know. And then it goes into primary school and then secondary school, where we have more open conversations about different types of touches. And there's lots of schools already doing this work, and the Gillen report, I think, has stuff like this in it as well, you know. So hopefully, you know, with the implementation of that report, I think we will make a lot of progress. So yeah, it must happen in schools, and it doesn't have to happen in all the classes and all of the schools, but we need teachers in all the schools that are comfortable talking about this stuff.
And just, we only have time for one more question, unfortunately, but thank you for all your questions. They're amazing. Lindsay wants to know, as mental health champion, what plans do you have in the future to be raising this issue of consent, so that more people are encouraged to report and seek help?
Well, that's a really good question. At the minute, I'm trying to plan my strategy and think about what issues we need to take forward. And this opportunity today has really opened up that whole area for me. So I would really be keen to talk to Victim Support NI and some of the other organisations to see how we can improve this, and we can get the Gillen report implemented and improve the treatments for people who've been subjected to sexual violence as well. So let's have that discussion. And let's everybody actually respond to the mental health strategy and think about where this fits in there, where trauma-focused therapies fit in there, where people who've been subjected to sexual violence, where they fit within the strategy and where they receive treatments.
Thank you very much, Siobhan. There's a lot of questions and a lot of love for your presentation and what you're saying. But unfortunately, we have run out of time for this session. So I'm going to hand back to Jerry.
Thank you very much. As Louise said, it was a really well received presentation, and there's certainly, from the looks of the questions on the Q&A function, there's a lot of interest and support for your work, and certainly a real push there for what you can do to help the